The fall of Constantinople was so much worse than you think. Let me ask you something. When you hear the words, the fall of Constantinople, what picture comes to mind? For most people, it's a single image. Maybe you've seen it in a documentary or a history book. A bunch of wooden ships pulled over land on greased logs. Ottoman cannons the size of small houses. A desperate last stand at a massive gate. And then a young sultan rides into a church. The end. Byzantium is gone. And that's technically true. But here's the problem. That version of the story is like saying World War II was some stuff that happened in Europe and the Pacific. It's not wrong. It's just insultingly incomplete. What I'm going to show you today is that the fall of Constantinople in 1453 wasn't just a military defeat. It wasn't just the end of a 1,000-year empire. It was a psychological, spiritual, and technological catastrophe that we are still, in some ways, recovering from. And the actual events of those 53 days in the spring of 1453 are so horrifying, so bizarre, and so filled with moments where history almost bent the other way, that once you hear the full story, you'll realize something. We've been telling this story all wrong. Because the fall of Constantinople wasn't just sad, it wasn't just dramatic, it was so much worse than you think. Let me take you back to a city that should have died 1,000 times before it finally did. Imagine yourself walking through Constantinople in the year 1400, about 53 years before the fall. If you were a visitor from Western Europe, you wouldn't believe your eyes. Not because of the beauty, though the city was still beautiful in a crumbling, haunted sort of way. No, you wouldn't believe it because the city was still standing at all. By 1400, the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of the Roman Empire that had once stretched from Britain to Babylon, had been reduced to little more than a city-state. Look at a map. The Ottomans controlled everything around it, everything. Constantinople was an island of Roman stone in a sea of Turkish horsemen. The population of the city, which had once held 500,000 people, had collapsed to somewhere between 40 and 50,000. Entire neighborhoods inside the famous Theodosian walls had been turned into farmland. Not decorative gardens, actual farms. Sheep grazed where Roman senators once walked. People grew vegetables in the ruins of palaces. The great hippodrome, where chariot races had once sparked riots that toppled emperors, was a silent field of broken columns. The imperial palace was largely abandoned, with rooms used for storage or left to rot under leaking roofs. The famous Church of the Holy Apostles, the second most important church in the empire, had lost entire sections to earthquakes and neglect. This was an empire that had become a joke. The Ottoman sultans, who ruled from their capital in Adrianople, didn't even bother to finish off Constantinople because, frankly, it wasn't worth the effort. Why waste good soldiers on a city that was already dead? The Byzantines couldn't even pay their own mercenaries. The emperor, Manuel II Palaiologos, famously had to sell the family silver, literally, to raise enough money to bribe the Ottomans to leave him alone. And by 1449, when Constantine XI Palaiologos became emperor, the situation was even worse. Constantine was a good man, brave, honorable, competent. But competence doesn't matter when you're ruling a ghost. He was crowned in the Peloponnese, not even in his own capital. Because Constantinople could no longer afford a proper coronation ceremony, the empire he inherited consisted of the city of Constantinople itself, a few scattered islands in the Aegean, the city of Mystrus in southern Greece, and a small strip of the Peloponnese. That's it. Oh, and the entire empire was a tributary vassal to the Ottoman Turks, meaning they paid taxes to the man who would eventually try to destroy them. So here's the first thing that makes the fall worse than you think. When Mehmed II, the young Ottoman Sultan, decided to take Constantinople in 1453, he wasn't conquering a great empire. He was putting down a stubborn cockroach that had somehow survived for 200 years after it should have been dead. And the fact that Constantinople held out for 53 days against the most powerful siege artillery the world had ever seen. That's not a story of imperial decline. That's a story of impossible, suicidal, almost supernatural defiance. The walls. To understand the siege, you have to understand the walls. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople are one of the great engineering marvels of human history. Built in the early 5th century under Emperor Theodosius II, they had defended the city for over 1,000 years. Think about that for a second. These walls had been standing since before the fall of the Western Roman Empire, before the rise of Islam, before Charlemagne, before the Vikings, before the Norman conquest of England. And they had never been breached, not once. There had been close calls. Avars, Persians, Arabs, Bulgarians, Russians. All kinds of people had thrown themselves at these walls. In 717 to 718, an Arab army of maybe 120,000 men had besieged Constantinople for an entire year. They had ships, siege towers, catapults, everything, and they failed. The walls held. What made the Theodosian walls so terrifying was their design. This wasn't just a single wall, it was a 3-layer system. First, you had a deep moat, about 60 feet wide and 25 feet deep. If you wanted to attack the walls, you had to fill that moat while people were shooting at you. Once you crossed the moat, assuming you didn't die in the process, you hit the outer wall. This was a relatively low wall, maybe 25 feet high, but it was studded with towers. From these towers, defenders could shoot down at you from multiple angles. If you somehow took the outer wall, you weren't done. You now faced the inner wall. This was the real monster. It was over 40 feet high, 12 to 15 feet thick, and bristling with 96 massive towers. Each tower could operate as its own independent fortress. Even if you took a section of the wall, the towers on either side could still pour fire into your position. And here's the thing that attackers always forgot. The walls weren't just stone. They were alive. For 1,000 years, the people of Constantinople had practiced defending these walls. Every citizen knew their assigned section. Teenage boys learned which tower they would man in an emergency. Women were trained to carry water and ammunition to the defenders. The entire city was, in a very real sense, a living military machine. In 1453, that machine was old and creaky and underfunded, but it was still there. Mehmed II looked at these walls. He studied them, and he realized something that no previous Ottoman Sultan had been willing to admit. To take Constantinople, you needed artillery, not the small, unreliable cannons that had been around for a few decades. You needed monsters. So he built them. The monster. The Hungarian engineer named Urban understood bronze. He had come to Constantinople first, offering his services to Emperor Constantine. He said he could build a cannon that would make the walls tremble. But Constantine, as usual, had no money. He could offer only a modest salary and vague promises of future land grants. So Urban went to the other side. Mehmed II, who was all of 21 years old at the time, asked Urban one question. "Can you make a cannon that will destroy the walls of Constantinople?" Urban said yes. Mehmed asked another question. "How much?" And here's where the story gets chilling. Mehmed didn't haggle. He didn't try to get a discount. He told Urban to name his price, and then he quadrupled it. He also gave Urban access to entire foundries, tons of bronze, and as many skilled metal workers as he needed. The young sultan understood something that older, wiser rulers often forget. Sometimes the expensive solution is the only solution. Urban got to work. And what he built was arguably the most terrifying weapon the world had ever seen. His Great Bombard, as it came to be called, was 27 feet long. It weighed 17 tons. It fired stone balls that weighed 1,500 pounds, about the weight of a small car. The cannon had to be moved by a team of 60 oxen and 200 men. It took them 2 months just to drag it from Adrianople to the walls of Constantinople, a distance of only about 140 miles. When it was fired, the sound could be heard from 10 miles away. The shock wave shattered windows throughout the city. The concussion alone was known to kill people who stood too close. And the stone ball, moving at supersonic speed, would hit the Theodosian walls with the force of a small earthquake. But here's the problem with giant cannons. They explode. Bronze is tricky. It expands and contracts with heat. The Great Bombard took about 3 hours to cool down between shots. If you tried to fire it more often, the bronze would crack. And since this was 15th century engineering, there were no backup plans. Every time Urban pulled the lanyard, he was essentially gambling that his welds would hold and his cannon wouldn't turn into a giant fragmentation grenade. During the siege, the Great Bombard would indeed crack. It would be repaired. It would crack again. The whole siege became a race between Ottoman engineers repairing their superweapon and Byzantine repair crews filling the gaps in their walls with rubble, dirt, and anything else they could find. But Urban's cannon wasn't the only problem. Mehmed had dozens of other cannons, smaller but still devastating. He had mortars that could lob shells over the walls. He had bombards that could fire chains and scrap metal as improvised anti-personnel weapons. All told, the Ottoman siege train was the most powerful artillery force in history up to that point. And yet for weeks, it wasn't enough. The first days. The siege began on April 6, 1453. Mehmed set up his camp about a mile from the land wall, the western side of the city where the Theodosian defenses faced the open countryside. His army was enormous. Modern estimates range from 80,000 to 100,000 men, plus about 30,000 irregulars and camp followers. There were also somewhere between 70 and 126 ships in the Ottoman Navy. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine had maybe 7,000 soldiers. 7,000 against perhaps 100,000. And of those 7,000, only a few hundred were actually trained, experienced warriors. The rest were militia, monks, sailors, and ordinary citizens who had been handed a spear and told to guard a section of wall. Among the defenders were about 700 armed men from Genoa, led by a brilliant mercenary commander named Giovanni Giustiniani. He was, by all accounts, the best military engineer of his generation. He arrived in Constantinople just a few weeks before the siege began, with 2 ships full of weapons and armor. Constantine immediately made him commander of the land walls. The other 6,300 defenders were a mix of Greeks, Venetians, Cretans, Catalans, and even a handful of Ottomans who had defected. There were monks from the great monasteries who had never held a sword before. There were old men who had fought in civil wars decades ago. There were teenage boys who had lied about their age to join the defense. This was not an army. It was a suicide pact in progress. But here's the thing about the Theodosian walls. They were force multipliers. A good defender behind those walls was worth 10 attackers, maybe 20. The walls negated the Ottoman numerical advantage. They turned the siege into a battle of logistics and morale. On April 7th, Mehmed ordered a preliminary bombardment. The great bombard fired for the first time. The stone ball hit the outer wall near the gate of St. Romanus. The impact was spectacular. A section of the wall collapsed into rubble, but the defenders had seen this coming. They immediately began rebuilding. By morning, the gap had been filled with wooden beams, earth, and bundles of twigs. It wasn't pretty, but it would stop a man from walking through. This pattern repeated itself for the next 2 weeks. Mehmed would order his cannons to concentrate on one section of the wall. The stone balls would smash through the medieval masonry. And every night, the defenders, including the emperor himself carrying rubble alongside his soldiers, would rebuild what had been destroyed. Imagine the frustration. Mehmed had the most powerful weapons on earth, and every morning he would look at the walls and see that they were still there, still standing, still mocking him, the chain. While the land walls were being battered, Mehmed also had to deal with the sea. Constantinople was a peninsula. 3 sides faced water. The Sea of Marmara to the south, the Golden Horn Inlet to the north, and the Bosporus straight to the east. If Mehmed couldn't control the water, the city could be resupplied indefinitely. The Byzantines had prepared for this. Across the mouth of the Golden Horn, they had stretched a massive chain. This wasn't some little anchor chain. This was a boom, a floating barrier of logs and metal links supported by wooden pontoons, stretching from the city's northern wall to the Galata Tower on the opposite shore. The chain was so heavy that no ship could break through it. Any vessel trying to enter the Golden Horn would get tangled in the boom and then shot to pieces by the defenders on the walls. Behind this chain, in the protected waters of the Golden Horn, the Byzantine navy, all 26 ships of it, waited. They weren't much, but they were enough to keep the Ottoman navy honest. Mehmed's solution to the chain is one of the most famous episodes of the siege, but almost nobody understands how insane it actually was. He decided to move his ships overland. Think about that. We're talking about 72 warships, each weighing many tons, with masts and rigging and crew compartments. Mehmed ordered his engineers to build a road, a greased wooden track, across the hills of Galata, completely bypassing the chain. The ships would be dragged overland on log rollers, pulled by oxen and men, and then relaunched into the Golden Horn above the chain. The Byzantine defenders on the walls watched this happen in disbelief. They could see the Ottoman ships moving across the hills like great wooden beasts sliding over the landscape. It was impossible. It was absurd. It was happening. The operation took one night. By morning, the Ottoman navy was inside of the Golden Horn, threatening the northern walls of the city for the first time. This was a psychological blow as much as a military one. The defenders had believed the chain made them safe. They had believed the sea was secure. Now, suddenly, nowhere was safe. Mehmet had proven that he was willing to do things no previous commander had ever even imagined. The siege tightens. With the Golden Horn now contested, the defenders had to spread their already thin forces even thinner. Sections of the sea walls, which had been relatively safe, now needed garrisons. Men were pulled from the land walls to watch the water. And still, the walls held. By late April, Mehmet was getting desperate. His cannons were breaking down. The great bombard had cracked so badly that Urban had to abandon it for a week to make repairs. Ottoman morale was suffering. The soldiers had been promised a quick victory, a short siege, easy plunder. Instead, they were living in muddy camps, eating stale bread, and watching their comrades get shot down by Greek archers on walls that refused to fall. There were desertions. Small groups of Ottoman soldiers, mostly Christian conscripts from the Balkans, slipped away in the night and made their way to the Byzantine lines. The defenders welcomed them, fed them, and put them to work on the walls. Mehmet responded with terror. He ordered his executioners to behead any deserter caught by Ottoman patrols. The heads were placed on stakes in front of the army as a warning. But still, men left. The young Sultan also tried something else. He offered Constantine a deal. If the city surrendered, Mehmet would guarantee the safety of every inhabitant. He would let Constantine rule a small principality in the Peloponnese. The Byzantine church would be left alone. The city would not be sacked. It was a generous offer. Too generous, perhaps. And that made it suspicious. Constantine gathered his advisors. Some argued for surrender. The situation was hopeless. They were outnumbered 20-1. The cannons were slowly but surely eating through the walls. A negotiated surrender would save lives. But Constantine refused. He gave his famous answer. To surrender the city to you is beyond my authority or anyone else's who lives in it. For all of us have freely decided to die and will not spare our lives. This sounds noble, and it was, but it was also calculating. Constantine knew that Mehmet's offer was a trap. If the city surrendered, the Ottomans would enter peacefully. But then what? The defenders would be disarmed. The gates would be open. And Mehmet, who was 21 years old and hungry for glory, would have no reason to keep his promises. A sacked city could be plundered. A surrendered city offered nothing. Constantine was betting on time. He knew that help was coming. The Pope had promised ships. The Venetians had promised a relief fleet. If Constantinople could hold out long enough, the Ottoman army would melt away. Winter was coming. Disease was spreading. Mehmet's own officers were whispering about abandoning the siege. But the help never came. Or rather, it came too late, and in the wrong form. The relief that wasn't. On May 23rd, a small Venetian brig slipped through the Ottoman blockade and reached the city. Its captain brought news. A relief fleet had been assembled in Venice. It had sailed south, past the Peloponnese, past the Aegean Islands. It was coming. But it was coming slowly. The Venetians had underestimated the Ottoman navy. They had assumed Mehmet would give up after a few weeks. By the time they realized the siege was serious, it was almost too late. The brig also brought a different kind of news. The Hungarian regent, John Hunyadi, who had defeated the Ottomans in battle just a few years earlier, had refused to help. The German princes had refused. The King of France had refused. Even the Genoese, who had colonies in the Black Sea, dependent on Constantinople, had refused. The city was alone. Not because the rest of Europe hated Byzantium, though many did, but because they genuinely didn't think Constantinople could fall. The walls had stood for 1,000 years. They would stand for 1,000 more. The Ottomans would get bored and go home. That's what always happened. This is another way the fall was worse than you think. The rest of Christendom didn't betray Constantinople. They simply couldn't imagine its destruction. And by the time they realized their mistake, the city was already gone. The prophecy. Now we come to the strangest part of the siege. The part that makes people think the whole thing was scripted. There was an old prophecy in Constantinople, dating back to the city's founding. It said that the city would never fall as long as the moon shone, not the literal moon, necessarily. The prophecy was more poetic. It meant that as long as light shone on the city, as long as there was any hope at all, Constantinople would endure. On May 22nd, 3 days before the final assault, the moon vanished. It was a lunar eclipse. We know this now. But in 1453, a lunar eclipse was an omen. It was a sign from God, and the timing could not have been worse. The defenders watched as the moon turned red, then black. They prayed, they wept, they begged God to show them mercy. And the moon did not return for hours. The next morning there were processions through the streets. The famous icon of the Virgin Mary, believed to protect the city, was carried along the walls. But as the priests carried the icon, it slipped from their hands and fell into the mud. They picked it up, but a few hours later it happened again. The icon fell a second time, then came the fog. A strange, thick fog rose from the Bosporus and enveloped the city. It was unlike any fog the old men of Constantinople had ever seen. It was dark, almost oily, and when it lifted, the defenders saw something impossible. A strange light was flickering above the dome of the Hagia Sophia. It rose from the great church, ascended into the sky, and vanished. The priests said it was the Holy Spirit leaving the city. The Holy Spirit, which had guarded Constantinople for 1,000 years, was finally abandoning them. These were not omens in hindsight. These were real events that the defenders witnessed and interpreted in real time. The moon went dark. The icon fell. The holy light departed. God, they believed, had stopped protecting them. And then came the final sign. On the night of May 28th, a terrible storm lashed the city. Thunder and lightning. Wind so strong that the defenders could barely stand on the walls. But the storm passed as quickly as it had come. And when the clouds cleared, the defenders saw something that made their blood run cold. The Ottoman camp was lit by thousands of fires, and the fires were not spread out as they had been for weeks. They were concentrated. They were moving. They were organizing. Mehmed was preparing for the final assault. The night before. What happened on the night of May 28th, 1453, is almost too sad to describe, but you need to understand it, because it's the heart of why this story is so much worse than the textbooks tell you. Emperor Constantine XI knew he would probably die tomorrow. He had known it for weeks. But now, with the omens and the storm and the Ottoman camp organizing for a final push, certainty had replaced probability. He would die. His city would fall. And all he could do now was make the death mean something. He gathered his commanders in the imperial palace. The palace was dark. The chandeliers had been stripped for their metal. The tapestries had been cut up for bandages. The throne room, once adorned with gold and marble, was a bare stone hall. Constantine addressed his men. He thanked them for their service. He apologized for not being able to pay them properly. He asked them to fight one more day. Then he did something extraordinary. He walked through the streets of the city visiting the defenders on the walls. He didn't send a messenger. He went himself, in full armor, with no attendants. He climbed the ladders to the battlements. He shook hands with the monks and the teenagers and the old veterans. At the gate of St. Romanus, the section of wall that had taken the worst punishment from the cannons, he found Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander. The two men embraced. Giustiniani was exhausted. His armor was dented from stone fragments. His hands were bloody from handling rubble. But he smiled when he saw the emperor. "We'll hold," Giustiniani said. "One more day." Constantine nodded. He turned to the defenders on the wall. They were mostly Greeks, but there were Italians, Catalans, even a few Turks who had converted to Christianity. They were dirty and tired and hungry and terrified, and they were still standing. "Remember," Constantine said, "the ancient glory of Rome, the splendor of our fathers, the greatness of our city, and fight." It was a good speech. It was probably the last good speech ever given in Latin in the presence of a Roman emperor. Then Constantine returned to his palace. He spent the night in prayer in the Hagia Sophia. The great church was packed with people, not just soldiers, but women and children and old people. They had come to say goodbye to their city. They sang hymns and lit candles and wept. Outside, the Ottoman camp was silent. Mehmed had ordered his men to rest. He had promised them that tomorrow they would have Constantinople. He had promised them 3 days of plunder. 3 days of killing, rape, and theft. All of it legal. All of it sanctioned by Islamic law, which allowed 3 days of sack after a city taken by force. The soldiers slept on their weapons. The cannons were loaded. The ships were positioned. At about midnight, the defenders on the walls heard something strange, singing, coming from the Ottoman camp. They listened carefully. It wasn't war music. It wasn't drums or trumpets. It was a single voice, high and clear, singing the call to prayer. An hour later, the singing stopped, and the waiting began. May 29th, 1453, the final assault. The attack began at first light, around 1:30 in the morning. Mehmed had organized his army into 3 waves. The first wave was the irregulars, the conscripts, the prisoners, the camp followers. They were the expendable ones. Their job was not to take the walls. Their job was to tire out the defenders, to use up their arrows and their Greek fire and their energy. The irregulars rushed forward with ladders and ropes. They crossed the moat, what was left of it anyway, partially filled with rubble and bodies from earlier attacks. They climbed the outer wall, and the defenders killed them. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The Byzantine archers and crossbowmen on the towers shot down into the mass of men below. Each arrow found a target. Each stone dropped from the battlements crushed a skull. The irregulars broke and ran, but the Ottoman military police behind them drove them back with whips and swords. For 2 hours, the irregulars died. Thousands of them. Their bodies piled up in the moat. Their blood ran in streams down the slope of the wall. Then came the second wave. This was the Anatolian conscripts, professional soldiers from the Asian provinces, better trained, better equipped, and more motivated. They advanced in formation, carrying a battering ram and a siege tower on wheels. The defenders were exhausted. Their arrows were running low. Their arms ached from the constant action. But they kept fighting. Women were now on the walls, carrying stones and boiling oil to the battlements. Children ran through the streets with messages and supplies. The Anatolians reached the outer wall. They raised their ladders. They climbed. And the defenders pushed the ladders back, sending men crashing to the ground below. They poured hot pitch on the siege tower, setting it on fire. They fought with swords and axes when the Ottomans got close enough. For 3 more hours, the Anatolians died. They died by the hundreds. They died by the 1,000. And when the sun finally rose over the city, they had taken nothing. The walls were battered and smoking, but they were still Byzantine. Now it was time for the third wave. The Janissaries. The Janissaries. If you don't know what the Janissaries were, you need to understand this. They were not ordinary soldiers. They were slave soldiers, taken as children from Christian families in the Balkans, converted to Islam, and raised from birth to be the perfect warriors. They had no families of their own, no loyalties outside the Sultan. They ate together, slept together, trained together, and died together. The Janissaries were the most disciplined, most fanatical, most terrifying infantry in the world. And Mehmet had kept them in reserve, waiting for the moment when the defenders were at their limit. That moment had come. The Janissaries advanced in tight formation, their shields locked together, their swords and axes gleaming in the morning light. They did not shout or scream like the irregulars. They moved in silence. They climbed over the piles of dead Anatolians and walked across the moat on the bodies of their own comrades. Emperor Constantine had been watching from the inner wall. He saw the Janissaries coming. He knew this was the end. He called his commanders. "We will fight in the breach," he said. "If the walls fall, we will hold the gap." The breach he was talking about was the section of wall near the gate of St. Romanus. The great bombard had hammered that section for weeks. It had been rebuilt so many times that it was now more rubble than stone. The Janissaries were heading straight for it, the wound that killed the city. This is the moment that historians still argue about. The moment when one man's wound changed the course of history. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, was leading the defense at the breach. He was everywhere at once, shouting orders, dragging wounded men to safety, swinging his sword at any Ottoman head that appeared over the rubble. He had been fighting for 8 hours. He had not slept in 2 days. His armor was cracked. His sword was notched from parrying Ottoman blades, and then a bullet hit him. It was not a modern bullet, of course. It was a lead ball from an Ottoman arquebus, a primitive firearm, but deadly at close range. The ball struck Giustiniani in the chest, just below his right shoulder. It did not kill him, but it shattered his collarbone and tore through his lung. Giustiniani fell. His men carried him back from the breach. He was bleeding heavily, struggling to breathe. He begged his men to take him to a ship. He needed a surgeon. He needed to get out of the city. Emperor Constantine arrived at the breach just as Giustiniani was being carried away. He grabbed the Genoese commander's arm. "Stay," he said, "for 1 more hour. For God's love, stay." But Giustiniani was in shock. He couldn't speak. His men pushed past Constantine and carried their commander toward the harbor. And that was it. The defenders at the breach, seeing their leader being carried away, hesitated. They didn't run, they didn't panic, but they hesitated. And in that moment of hesitation, the Janissaries poured through the gap. The emperor's last stand. The rest of the story happens very quickly. Constantine knew the city was lost. He removed his imperial regalia, the purple cloak, the jeweled crown, the gilded armor. He didn't want to be recognized. He put on simple plate armor, the kind any soldier might wear. He gathered the men who were still with him. There were maybe 100 of them, Greeks mostly, but also a handful of Genoese who had refused to abandon their posts. They formed a small square near the breach. "We meet our ancestors today," Constantine said. Then he drew his sword and charged into the Janissaries. Nobody knows exactly how Constantine died. His body was never found. Some say he was cut down by a Janissary, who didn't recognize him. Some say he threw off his armor and ran into the crowd, hoping to escape. Some say he died fighting with a sword in one hand and a cross in the other. What we know is this: the last Roman emperor, the heir to Augustus and Constantine the Great, died in the rubble of a broken wall, surrounded by the bodies of his enemies and his friends. He was 49 years old. And now we come to the part that the history books always gloss over, the part that is genuinely, almost unimaginably horrible. Mehmet had promised his men 3 days of sack. 3 days of total, unrestricted violence. For soldiers who had been living in mud for 53 days, who had watched their comrades die by the thousands, who had been promised the riches of the greatest city in the world. This was not a suggestion. It was a right. When the Janissaries broke through the walls, they did not go straight for the palaces or the churches. They went for the people. The sack of Constantinople lasted 3 days. It was not a battle. It was a butcher's shop. Soldiers killed everyone they found in the streets. Men, women, children. It didn't matter. The orders were simple. If you are not a soldier of the Sultan, you are plunder. Some women tried to hide in churches. The soldiers broke down the doors and dragged them out. Some men tried to fight back. They were killed on the spot. The killing was not the worst part. The worst part was what came after. Tens of thousands of civilians were rounded up and herded to the slave markets. The Ottomans had been running a slave economy for centuries, and they knew how to process large numbers of captives efficiently. Men were separated from women. Children were separated from parents. Everyone was stripped, examined, and sorted by age, health, and appearance. The young and the beautiful were set aside for the highest prices. The old and the sick were killed where they stood. Why waste food on slaves who wouldn't survive the journey? The children, the ones who were healthy but too young to work, were taken to be raised as janissaries or servants. By the end of the 3 days, somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 people had been enslaved. The population of Constantinople before the siege had been perhaps 50,000, do the math. Almost everyone who survived the sack was marched away in chains. The Hagia Sophia, the great church of the holy wisdom of God, was looted within hours of the walls falling. Soldiers tore down the golden mosaics, ripped the silver from the altar, and smashed the marble icons. An old priest was found kneeling before the main altar, praying. A janissary cut his throat and left him lying in a pool of blood. That afternoon, Mehmet himself rode into the city. He went straight to the Hagia Sophia. He dismounted at the door, bent down, and scooped up a handful of dirt. He poured it over his turban as a sign of humility. Then he walked into the church. The scene inside was indescribable. Dead bodies everywhere. The smell of blood and smoke. Soldiers still looting. Still fighting over golden candlesticks and jeweled chalices.
Mehmet did not react with horror or disgust. He walked to the main altar, climbed the steps, and turned to face his commanders. "Let this be a mosque," he said, "from this day forward and forever."
A muezzin was summoned. The call to prayer echoed through the great dome for the first time. And the Hagia Sophia, which had been the center of Orthodox Christianity for almost 1,000 years, became a mosque. So that's the story. City falls, emperor dies. People enslaved, church becomes mosque. The end. But here's why it's so much worse than you think. Because the story doesn't end there. The consequences of 1453 ripple forward through history in ways that most people never learn. Let me give you 3 examples. First, Des, the population transfer. When Mehmet repopulated Constantinople after the sack, he didn't just bring in Turks. He brought in Greeks from the Peloponnese, Jews from the Balkans, Armenians from the Caucasus, even Italians from Genoa. He wanted a cosmopolitan city, a trading hub. But he also wanted a docile population. So he created the millet system. Each religious community, Orthodox, Jewish, Armenian, Catholic, was given its own leader, its own courts, its own tax collectors. They were allowed to practice their religions freely. They were not forced to convert. This sounds tolerant, and in some ways it was. But it was also a brilliant system of control. By dividing his subjects by religion, Mehmet ensured they would never unite against him. The Orthodox Greeks hated the Catholic Italians. The Armenians hated the Greeks. The Jews kept to themselves, and the Ottomans ruled over all of them. That system, the millet system, lasted for almost 500 years. It is the direct ancestor of the sectarian divisions that still tear apart the Middle East today. When you see Sunni and Shia killing each other in Iraq, or Greeks and Turks fighting over Cyprus, or Armenians and Azerbaijanis shooting at each other in Nagorno-Karabakh, you are seeing the long shadow of verse 1453. Second, the fall of Constantinople is the reason Russia thinks of itself as the Third Rome. In 1472, Ivan III, the Grand Prince of Moscow, married Sophia Paleologina, the niece of Constantine XI. Sophia brought Byzantine rituals, Byzantine court customs, and the Byzantine double-headed eagle to Moscow. Ivan's courtiers began calling him Tsar, the Russian word for Caesar. The Russian Orthodox Church declared Moscow the Third Rome, the true heir to Byzantium. This idea that Russia is the inheritor of Roman glory, that Moscow is the new Constantinople, that the Russian Tsar is the protector of all Orthodox Christians, this idea has shaped Russian foreign policy for 500 years. It is why Russia fought the Ottomans for centuries. It is why Russia supports Orthodox rebels in the Balkans. It is why Putin sees himself as the defender of traditional Christianity against the decadent West. When you hear Russian politicians talk about the Russian world or the Orthodox civilization, you are hearing the echo of a city that fell in 1453. And third, the fall of Constantinople ended the Middle Ages. I know that sounds dramatic, but it's true. The scholars who fled the city before and after the sack brought Greek manuscripts to Italy. Not just any manuscripts. The works of Plato and Aristotle, Euclid and Galen, Sophocles and Euripides. Works that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries for 1,000 years but were largely unknown in the West. These manuscripts fueled the Renaissance. They gave Italian humanists access to classical learning that had been lost for centuries.
They inspired new ways of thinking about politics, art, science, and religion. Within 50 years of the fall, Copernicus was developing his heliocentric model. Within 100 years, Martin Luther was nailing his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. If Constantinople had not fallen, if the Byzantine Empire had limped along for another 100 years, the Renaissance might have been delayed. The Reformation might never have happened. The modern world, the world of science, democracy, individualism, might have been born much later, or in a completely different form. We don't know what would have happened, but we know what did happen. And what happened was that a city of ghosts, ruled by a man who sold the family silver, defended by monks and teenagers and a Genoese mercenary, held out for 53 days against the most powerful army on earth. And when it fell, it took the old world with it. Here's the thing that keeps me up at night. The what if. What if the relief fleet had arrived a week earlier? What if the Great Bombard had exploded a day sooner? What if Giovanni Giustiniani had not been shot? What if the moon had not gone dark? What if the icon had not fallen? What if the fog had not come? What if? Constantine was so close. The defenders were so close. If they had held out for another week, maybe two, the Ottoman army would have had to withdraw. Winter was coming. Disease was spreading. Mehmed's own officers were grumbling. The Janissaries were taking heavy casualties. If Constantinople had survived 1453, if the Byzantine Empire had somehow stumbled on for another generation, the history of Europe and the Middle East would be unrecognizable. No Ottoman domination of the Balkans, no Russian Third Rome, no Renaissance triggered by fleeing Greek scholars, no Columbus sailing west to find a sea route to Asia because the land route to Asia would still have been partially Christian. We can't know, but we can imagine. And when we imagine what might have been, the real tragedy of 1453 comes into focus. It's not just that a city fell, it's that a future died, a future where East and West might have learned to coexist, a future where classical learning might have been preserved without war, a future where the Roman Empire, the oldest continuous political institution in human history, might have faded out peacefully, rather than being destroyed in blood and fire. That future died on May 29th, 1453, in the rubble of the Theodosian walls. So here we are, at the end. I told you the fall of Constantinople was worse than you think. I hope you believe me now. It wasn't just a battle. It wasn't just a siege. It was the death of a world. And like all deaths, it was messy and sad and strange, and full of moments where you think, if only, if only, if only. The people who died in 1453 were not characters in a history book. They were real. The emperor who took off his crown and charged into the Janissaries was real. The priest who was killed at the altar of Hagia Sophia was real. The women who were herded into slave markets were real. The children who were taken from their parents to be raised as soldiers for the man who killed their families were real. When you walk through Istanbul today, because that's what Constantinople is now, Istanbul, you can still see the scars. The Theodosian walls are still there, crumbling and patched, with bullet holes and cannon damage visible in the stone. The Hagia Sophia is still there, now a museum, then a mosque, now a museum again, with Christian mosaics and Islamic calligraphy side by side on the same walls. And if you stand in front of the walls at the gate of St. Romanus, where Constantine made his last stand, You might feel something, a chill, a sense of weight, the knowledge that you are standing where the old world ended. The fall of Constantinople was the end of something that had lasted for over 2,000 years. From the founding of Rome in 753 BC to the fall of Constantinople in 1453 AD, that's 2,206 years of continuous Roman civilization.
No other human institution has ever lasted that long. Not the pharaohs of Egypt, not the emperors of China, not the Catholic Church. Rome. And it ended not with a whimper, but with a scream, with cannons and fire and blood and chains, with a 21-year-old sultan who moved ships overland because he refused to accept that anything was impossible, with a 49-year-old emperor who knew he was going to die and fought anyway, with a 1,000-year-old wall that finally, after all those years, crumbled into dust. They say that Constantinople fell because God abandoned the city. I don't know about that. But I know that on May 29th, 1453, something left the world, something that has never quite come back. And that is why the fall of Constantinople was so much worse than you think. If you've made it this far, thank you. This story matters. Not because it's ancient history, but because it's living history. The divisions we see today, between East and West, between Christianity and Islam, between Russia and Europe, they all trace back in some way to the rubble of those walls. Mehmed II conquered a city, but in doing so, he created a wound that has never fully healed. A wound that still bleeds 570 years later. The next time you see the news from Syria, or Ukraine, or Cyprus, or any of the other places where the Ottoman legacy still burns like a slow fuse,
remember Constantinople? Remember the city that should have fallen 1,000 times before it finally did? Remember the emperor who died in the breach? And remember that history is not something that happened to other people long ago. It is happening now. It will always be happening now. And sometimes it breaks your heart.